The wedding dress outweighed the bride. Inside the glowing halls of St. Paul's Cathedral, hundreds of candles flickered against stained glass windows, their colors rippling across stone like liquid fire. The organ's thunder reverberated through the vaults as nobles from two kingdoms watched a 6-year-old girl take trembling steps toward a man more than 20 years her senior. Isabelle of France, barely tall enough to bear the weight of the gold-embroidered silk that dragged behind her, was about to become a queen. Not because she chose, not because she loved, but because she was born a princess, and princesses were currency in the economy of power. What unfolded that day wasn't some barbaric legend from the dark corners of antiquity. It was London. It was Paris. It was what Europe called civilization at its height. Yet beneath the gilded veils and divine hymns hid a story of cruelty and despair. To understand how a child ended up bound in silk and vows, we have to travel backward, to her beginning. November 9, 1389. The Louvre Palace trembled with screams, but they weren't from a birthing chamber's joy. King Charles VI of France was in the midst of a psychotic episode, convinced his body was made of glass. He refused to be touched, believing the slightest contact would shatter him to pieces. Guards tiptoed through corridors, terrified to brush against their sovereign. And elsewhere in that vast palace, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria delivered their fourth daughter, a girl named Isabelle, whose fate was already sealed before she opened her eyes. From her first breath, Isabelle was not a child but a diplomatic token. Her mother barely looked at her newborn before turning to matters of alliance and territory. The royal nursery was no place of laughter. It was a chamber of lessons and rehearsals. While other children played with dolls, Isabelle was taught to curtsy, to smile precisely, to silence her emotions behind protocol. Her toys were miniature thrones. Her lullabies were lessons in obedience. Queen Isabeau, ambitious and calculating, ruled in her husband's stead whenever madness consumed him, and each of his episodes strengthened her grip. Chroniclers of the time whispered bitterly that she loved jewels more than her children, that her affections were as cold as the marble halls she governed from. The French court was a glittering theater masking decay. Rival factions, the Armagnacs and Burgundians, poisoned, kidnapped, and assassinated in endless cycles of revenge. Even royal children had armed guards. Isabelle grew up learning not whom to trust but whom to fear. Her father's madness returned in violent waves. One moment he quoted poetry, the next he tore through halls naked, convinced demons hunted him. At 4, Isabelle watched him attempt to strangle her mother in a frenzy. She learned to recognize the signs, the trembling hands, the sudden hush that fell before chaos, long before she learned her alphabet. Survival, not innocence, became her first language. In an overlooked treasury record from 1394 lies a single haunting entry: iron bars commissioned for the window of Princess Isabelle's chamber. Not for defense, but to stop her from jumping. She was 5 years old, and already certain that death was preferable to the life awaiting her. Historians seldom print that line. It breaks the illusion of chivalric romance and noble courts. But paper doesn't lie. The budget line sits quietly in the archives. A child's despair reduced to an expense. By 1395, messengers from England arrived with an offer that would define her destiny. King Richard II, nearly 30 and recently widowed, needed peace with France and an heir to secure his throne. His treasury was drained by war, his people restless. Queen Isabeau saw opportunity. The plan was grotesquely simple. Peace for a price, her daughter, 6 years old, fluent only in French nursery rhymes, Isabelle became the living signature of a treaty. The English envoys debated her age, but French diplomats assured them that a child so young could be molded to Richard's liking. Completely his, they promised. That phrase, recorded in ink by royal scribes, remains one of the most chilling lines in medieval diplomacy. Before the treaty was sealed, the English delegation demanded to inspect the bride. Isabelle was brought before them, dressed like a doll, her small frame swallowed by silk. They asked her to smile, to speak, to walk. They examined her teeth and posture as if she were livestock. One lord whispered that she would ripen beautifully. Around them, diplomats nodded, satisfied. The contract was signed. France would pay 800,000 livres, nearly 2 years of England's royal income, in dowry. The marriage would not be consummated until she was older, but Richard would gain all other rights of a husband immediately. Control of her household, her education, her movements, her future. When told she would be queen, Isabelle's only question was, "May I bring my dolls?" That single innocent question about dolls is the most damning artifact of the entire saga. The court celebrated the engagement with pageantry. Seamstresses worked through nights crafting 12 wedding gowns and 40 ceremonial outfits. Her mother, who had shown her little warmth before, suddenly obsessed over every thread, every jewel. Not for love but triumph. She had bartered her daughter for peace. The farewells were theatrical. When King Charles VI, lucid for once, blessed Isabelle, he held her so tightly attendants had to pry her away. She screamed for him long after the palace disappeared from view, clutching a wooden doll until her palms bled. The handover took place in a field between Calais and England, a spectacle of silk tents, banners, and orchestrated joy. Latin chants echoed as papers were exchanged and gold counted. At that exact midpoint, Isabelle's identity vanished. Her French attendants dismissed, her beloved governess sent back, her small dog taken away because Richard disliked small animals. Even the language around her changed overnight. To 6-year-old ears, every sound became alien. Towns along the procession were ordered to cheer as she passed, but to Isabelle, the noise was like thunder. She confessed later to a priest that she thought the crowds were leading her to her execution. London in 1396 had never seen such opulence. Westminster Palace glimmered with cloth of gold banners. Every bell rang through the capital. Inside St. Paul's, the scene was dreamlike. Richard II, regal and resplendent, waited at the altar, a man nearly 5 times her age. When Isabelle entered, a murmur rippled through the guests. She was so small that 2 attendants carried her train. The crown kept slipping from her head. The archbishop knelt to reach her height. When asked for consent, she could not answer. An attendant whispered the words, and she repeated them faintly, "I will," 2 words that sealed her fate. The ring had to be forced onto her finger. Witnesses recorded that she winced. No one stopped the ceremony. The feast that followed was obscene. 2,000 guests, roasted swans, silver goblets overflowing with imported wines. Isabelle sat at the high table in a raised chair made to match adult height. She didn't eat. She stared at the wall. Later came the bedding ceremony, a ritual not meant for consummation but public display. Priests blessed the bed, courtiers drew curtains, and Richard climbed beside the trembling girl. He claimed later he never touched her, and no record disputes that. Yet in the morning she was found curled at the corner of the bed, silent for 3 days. Her first words afterward were in French. "When can I go home?" Surprisingly, Richard's treatment of her afterward was gentle. Perhaps genuinely so, perhaps calculated. He gave her a household at Windsor Castle staffed with French speakers, toys, books, and a white pony named Blanche. To the court it seemed paternal affection. To historians it remains a moral gray. Isabelle began to call him "my lord uncle," a child's attempt to redefine captivity as safety. He wrote poems about innocence, punished courtiers who mocked her. In portraits, he sat beside her small frame, hand placed protectively on her shoulder. It looked tender, and yet, tenderness inside captivity is still captivity. Behind the palace walls, she remained a possession. She was displayed before ambassadors as the symbol of peace. They marveled at her poise, her ability to recite lines in English she barely understood. But at night, she still played with dolls, woke screaming from nightmares, and cried for her father. Richard's court, though polished in ceremony, was a cage gilded with roses. Meanwhile, back in France, her father's mind fractured further and her mother squandered the dowry. Isabelle wrote letters, small, aching fragments to relatives who seldom replied. "I pray for you daily," one read. Another to her confessor confessed that she dreamt her old dog returned to her bedside and wept when she woke. She was 7. In 1399, the fragile world she knew collapsed. Richard's tyranny had alienated his nobles. Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile with an army. Within weeks, Richard was deposed and imprisoned. For England, it was a political coup. For 10-year-old Isabel, it was the loss of the only structure she understood. The man she both feared and depended on vanished into a dungeon, and soon into legend. Rumors said he was murdered. She was forbidden to see him, to mourn him, to even speak his name. When she screamed for answers, the corridors answered with silence. Henry IV had no use for a French child queen. He locked her away in Havering Palace, officially an honored guest. In truth a prisoner, letters censored, attendance dismissed, language forbidden. She spent years in isolation, pacing stone corridors, whispering to the walls in French so she wouldn't forget her voice. In one letter she wrote, "I dream of my home and wake to prison." Another, never sent, addressed to Richard. "They say you are dead, but I do not believe it. You promised to protect me. I wait for you still." It was signed simply, "Your Isabelle." By 13, she had endured more confinement than most prisoners of war. But something within her shifted. When Henry IV proposed she marry his son, Isabel refused, calmly, firmly, publicly. "I am Richard's widow," she declared. "I will marry no English prince." For the first time, the court saw defiance instead of meekness. She began to smuggle letters to France, hide messages in clothing linings, build quiet alliances. The silent pawn was becoming a player. When she finally returned to France in 1401, she was 13 but looked much older. The years in captivity had hollowed her eyes and sharpened her features. The homecoming she'd imagined was nothing like reality. Her father was again lost to madness. Her mother greeted her with political indifference. Civil war raged in Paris. Isabel, once the centerpiece of peace, now arrived as a forgotten relic of failed diplomacy. No parades, no celebrations, just the quiet shuffle of a girl walking through a palace that no longer felt like home. Yet, amidst the chaos, fate offered her one kindness. At 15, she was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orleans, a gentle youth of her own age. Their union, though arranged, blossomed into genuine affection. For the first time, Isabel was seen not as an instrument but as a person. They walked gardens together, exchanged poems, and spoke in their native tongue. She laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since childhood. Those who saw her wrote that she glowed as if waking from a long night. In 1409 she gave birth to a daughter, Jean. Witnesses wrote that Isabel held her newborn with fierce devotion, whispering lullabies through tears. After years of being unheld, she finally had someone to protect. But her body was frail, weakened by years of neglect and stress. The birth drained her strength. Physicians prescribed prayers and potions. None helped. Each day she grew paler, as if the weight of survival itself was consuming her. On September 13, 1409, Isabelle of France, once child bride, once Queen of England, once Duchess of Orleans, died quietly at age 20. No trumpets, no mourning processions. Just a note in court records listing the political implications of her death. Her last request was to hold her daughter one final time. Witnesses said she whispered something private into the baby's ear, words no one ever recorded. Perhaps a blessing, perhaps a warning. The secret died with her. Her tomb bears titles, Queen of England, Duchess of Orleans, but not truth. It doesn't say survivor. It doesn't say child sacrificed for peace. Yet the fragments she left, letters, chronicles, and financial records, paint a portrait of a girl devoured by politics and forgotten by history. Isabel was not the tragedy of a single child, but the mirror of an age that called cruelty diplomacy and innocence expendable. Her story reminds us that history's grandeur often hides its victims. The silks, the crowns, the treaties, they were built upon the small shoulders of girls like Isabel, sold in the name of peace. Through her, we see the truth of medieval power, that the greatest atrocities were committed not by monsters, but by men in crowns who believed they were righteous. She was not erased. She was endured. and through remembrance, she lives again.